The servants heard her before they saw her. It was 20 minutes past 5 in the morning. The sky above Blackthorn Estate was the color of old pewter, heavy, flat, and entirely unimpressed with the world beneath it. A light drizzle had been falling for 3 hours. The great stone manor sat quiet, wrapped in its usual dignified silence. Then the screaming started. Mrs. Cordelia Aldrich, the housekeeper, was the first to reach the window. She pressed her nose to the glass and squinted into the gray morning light. Below, in the grand carriage courtyard, stood a young woman, heavily pregnant, dress soaked straight through, dark hair plastered to her face, one hand gripping a ruined traveling trunk, the other hand pointing directly at the red-faced fish merchant standing 3 feet away from her. "You sold me rotten trout and expect full payment? Are you mad?" The merchant's cart stood near the estate gates where he delivered weekly to the kitchens. He was a large man who had survived 40 years of buyers, haggling, and English weather without flinching once. He flinched now. "You ate half of it already. Because hunger nearly carried me to heaven before your fish dragged me back. Half a poisoned meal is still poisoned, sir. I could have died. This child could have died. You could have killed 2 people for the price of 1 rotten trout, and here you stand demanding coins." The courtyard had frozen completely. 2 footmen stood near the entrance steps with their mouths open. A stable boy had dropped an entire bucket of oats. 3 kitchen maids had materialized at the downstairs window like they had been conjured there. Even the horses at the far end of the yard had stopped moving, ears forward, watching. Mrs. Aldrich turned from the window, pressed both hands flat against the wall, and whispered to nobody in particular, "Heaven preserve us." On the top step of the marble staircase, standing in the cold morning air with a heavy dressing coat thrown over his evening clothes, stood Edmund Ravenshaw, the Duke of Blackthorn. He was 32 years old, tall, dark-haired, the kind of still that is not calm, it is controlled. Every part of him was controlled. His jaw, his expression, his breathing. Even the way he stood, with both hands loose at his sides and his shoulders set, looked like a man who had made a private decision some years ago to feel as little as possible and had been mostly successful. He watched the woman in the courtyard with cold, gray eyes. She was still going. "And furthermore, do not attempt that face at me. I know that face. That is the face men make when they have done something wrong and are waiting to see if the woman is too tired to fight. I am not too tired. I am magnificently tired, and I am still fighting. Now give me back my 3 shillings, or I will speak to every cook from here to Dorset about this cart." The merchant looked at the Duke. His expression said everything. "Are you going to do something about this?" The Duke did not move. The woman in the courtyard turned. Her eyes swept upward and landed directly on him, standing at the top of the stairs in his dressing coat, watching her like she was an inconvenient weather event. She pointed. "You there with the funeral face. If you are wealthy enough to own this estate, then kindly instruct your people to stop selling poisoned fish to pregnant women at dawn. It is not a reasonable way to run a property." The Duke said nothing. The woman stared at him for 2 full seconds. Then she turned back to the merchant, extracted 3 shillings worth of argument through sheer stamina alone, pocketed her coins, grabbed her trunk, and dragged it toward the small cottage path at the eastern edge of the property without looking back. The courtyard remained still. The Duke turned and walked back inside. But as he crossed the entry hall, he stopped. He stood facing the wall, and he became aware, slowly and with deep irritation, that something in his chest had shifted. It was the first time in 2 years that anything had. Her full name, she announced to the head groundskeeper within 6 minutes of arriving, was Aveline Cecily Wycliffe, and she would be staying in her sister's cottage for the season while her sister, Primrose, was in Paris with her new husband. The head groundskeeper, a quiet man named Thomas, nodded politely. "Any questions?" Aveline asked, already pushing open the cottage door. "No, miss." "Good. Is there a working water pump?" "Yes, miss." Working, or pretending to work?" Thomas paused. "Mostly working, miss." Aveline stared at him for a moment, decided this was acceptable, and went inside. The cottage was small but solid. Stone walls, a kitchen with a decent fireplace, a sitting room with a window that looked out across the Duke's east garden, one bedroom upstairs with a soft mattress that she tested by sitting on the edge with both hands pressed to her lower back, eyes closed, breath slow. She was 8 months pregnant. Her body felt like it had been assembled incorrectly and nobody had checked the instructions. Her back hurt every morning. Her feet swelled every afternoon. She had not slept flat in 6 weeks because the moment she lay down, The baby began performing what felt like a full theatrical production. And none of that, not one single part of it, was the worst thing that had happened to her this year. The worst thing was Benedict Montclair. She had met him 11 months ago in Bath, at the Winter Assembly Rooms. He was 29, charming, beautifully dressed, and spoke with the effortless confidence of a man who had never doubted himself a single day in his life. He brought her flowers. He wrote her letters. He told her she was extraordinary. He promised her everything: marriage, security, a home, a future. He had been lying through every word. By February, she was pregnant. By March, his letters had slowed. By April, they had stopped entirely. By May, she had traveled to his London townhouse on Grosvenor Street to find it closed up, curtains drawn, and a neighbor who informed her, with mild sympathy, that Mr. Montclair had departed for the continent 3 weeks prior. The neighbor had no forwarding address. Avellini had stood on that pavement in the gray London drizzle, one hand pressed to the side of her swollen stomach, and understood, with the slow, grinding certainty that is somehow worse than shock, that she had been abandoned. She did not cry on the pavement. She had saved that for the coach ride home. She cried for approximately 45 minutes, and then stopped because she had always believed excessive weeping was something you did once, and then you stopped because the world did not pause for tears. She had nowhere to go. Her parents were dead. She had no savings of consequence. The one person who might help without judgment was her older sister Primrose, now Mrs. Primrose Hartwell, whose wedding she had attended in April while secretly 4 months pregnant and saying nothing to anyone. Primrose had left the cottage key with a neighbor before departing for Paris. There had been a letter, written 3 months ago, that said the cottage was Avellini's for as long as she needed it. Avellini was not entirely sure if the invitation still applied given the circumstances. She decided it did. Blackthorn Estate was in the northern part of Wiltshire, 40 miles from Bath, 23 miles from Salisbury, and roughly 1,000 miles from anywhere Avellini had ever imagined herself spending the final weeks of her pregnancy. The estate occupied nearly 400 acres. The main manor was 3 stories of pale stone with black iron fencing, 12 chimneys, an east and west garden, 2 walled kitchen gardens for fountains, a stable block, and enough servants to run a small country. Everything was immaculate. Everything was silent. Everything was deeply, suffocatingly ordered. Within 3 days, Avellini had violated most of it. It started with the butcher's delivery boy on Tuesday morning. The boy arrived at the kitchen gates with a mutton order and had the misfortune of passing directly below the cottage window at the exact moment Avellini was leaning out of it, trying to determine if the smell she was detecting was the mutton or something worse. It was the mutton. "That is gray," she called down. The boy looked up. "Beg pardon, miss?" "The mutton. It is gray on the outer edge. Either that sheep was ancient or your butcher is creative about his definition of fresh. I want to speak to whoever approved that cut." The boy did not speak to whoever approved the cut, but he did return to the butcher with a very detailed message. The butcher, apparently a proud man, returned the following morning to argue the point personally. This resulted in a 20-minute discussion in the middle of the estate's service lane that Mrs. Aldrich, the housekeeper, had to watch from the window with her hand pressed to her sternum. On Wednesday, 2 stable boys received a formal assessment of their walking style. "You there?" "Yes, both of you." "Why are you walking like that?" The boys looked at each other. "Like what, miss?" "Like your boots are full of wet sand. Chin up. Step properly. You're not carrying the weight of the monarchy, are you? Or are you?" On Thursday, she ate 6 pears from the kitchen garden while informing the young gardener that the east path needed better gravel because she had nearly turned her ankle twice and the baby was not going to install itself. On Friday, there was the goose. Nobody who witnessed it ever spoke of it without lowering their voice first. The goose in question lived near the East Fountain and had an attitude problem that the estate staff had tolerated for years because the previous duchess had been fond of it. Avellini encountered it at 2:30 in the afternoon while walking the garden path for her daily exercise. The goose stared at her. She stared at it. Then the goose made a sound that Avellini apparently interpreted as disrespectful. She chased it with an umbrella for 4 minutes across 2 garden beds, around the fountain, and through the herb garden before the goose escaped beneath a stone wall. The Duke, emerging from the manor's side entrance at that moment, witnessed the last 40 seconds of this. He stood perfectly still. Then he turned around and went back inside. That evening, his secretary found him standing at the library window, looking toward the garden with an expression that could not, strictly speaking, be called an expression at all, but was somehow different from his usual nothing. The secretary decided not to comment. She found the broken water pump on Saturday morning. She tried the handle. It coughed. She tried again. Nothing. She tried a third time with both hands and real intention. Still nothing. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. The baby kicked. She put one hand on her stomach and said, "I know. I agree." Then she walked to the main manor. Mrs. Aldridge intercepted her at the service entrance. "Miss Wycliffe, this entrance is for. I need to speak to the Duke. His Grace does not receive. His Grace owns a pump that does not pump. Kindly direct me, or I will find him myself. And I warn you, I am very good at finding people." Mrs. Aldridge found the Duke. He was in the East Study, reviewing his state ledgers, when the door opened, and the most pregnant woman he had encountered since his wife walked in without being announced. He looked up slowly. "Your Grace," Avellini said, stopping in the center of the room and dropping into a curtsy that was physically impressive given her current dimensions. "I apologize for the intrusion. The water pump in the cottage is broken. It has produced no water since this morning. I am requesting a repair." "Good morning," said the Duke. "It is." Briefly, the pump. He stared at her for a moment. Then he rose, crossed to the small table near the window where a water pitcher stood, poured a glass, and held it out toward her. She looked at the glass. She looked at him. She looked at the glass again. "One glass." "Yes, Your Grace." She set both hands on her stomach. "I am manufacturing an entire human being. This child drinks more per hour than Parliament does per session. One glass of water is not a solution. One glass of water is an insult. The pump will be repaired tomorrow." "Tomorrow. I see. And tonight, what does the manufacturing human being drink?" "Rain." She glanced out the window. "There is actually no rain today, so that option is not even available." The Duke picked up his pen. "I will send water to the cottage this evening." Sent water. Like a medieval monastery. "Miss Wycliffe." "Wycliffe, yes. That is correct. Avellini Wycliffe, currently resident of your broken cottage with your broken pump, awaiting your repair that will apparently begin tomorrow." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "You have a very large estate, Your Grace. It is a shame the pipes do not match the curtains." She left. The Duke stood at his desk. He looked at the door. He looked at the water glass. He sat back down, picked up his pen, stared at the ledger, and realized approximately 4 minutes later that he had read the same column of numbers 6 times and retained none of it. He put the pen down. That night, he sent a full pitcher of water to the cottage, 2 blankets, and a covered dish from the kitchen without explanation or note. He told himself it was simply what a responsible estate owner did for a tenant. He told himself that twice. The soup was a Thursday problem. It was a cold week in October, the sort of week that reminded everyone in England that autumn had no intention of being gentle. The wind came in off the west fields in long, gray sheets. The trees at the edge of the estate grounds had gone orange and violent. The main manor's chimneys put out smoke all day, and the smell of it mixed with something extraordinary coming from the kitchen block by 6 in the evening. Avellini smelled it through the cottage wall. She was at her small kitchen table, trying to write a letter and mostly failing, when it reached her. Beef. Onions. Something herbaceous. Something warm. Her stomach made a sound that startled even her. She pressed her hand to it. "I know," she said. She sat for another full minute. Then she got up, put on her coat, and walked to the manor. She found the kitchen entrance by instinct and smell alone. Mrs. Aldridge was not at the service door. Nobody was at the service door. Avellini pushed it open, followed the smell down the stone corridor, and found herself standing in the Duke's kitchen, a cavernous room with a wide hearth, copper pots ranked along the walls, and a pot on the fire big enough to bathe in. 2 kitchen maids spun around from the counter simultaneously. "Miss," one said. "Hello," said Avellini. "What is in that pot?" "His Grace's supper, miss. It is a beef and barley stew with." "Perfect." She crossed the kitchen, picked up a spoon from the rack, lifted the lid, smelled it with her whole face, and said, "Yes. That is extraordinary. That smells like being forgiven." "Miss, you cannot. I am doing it quite successfully, actually." The sound of boots in the corridor came at that exact moment. Avellini had just replaced the lid and was considering where to sit when the kitchen door opened and the Duke of Blackthorn walked in. He stopped. She was standing at his kitchen hearth, holding his spoon, wearing a traveling coat with her hair half undone from the day, looking at him with the particular expression of someone who has decided, at a deep level, that they have already committed to this, and there is no point retreating now. "Good evening, Your Grace." He looked at the spoon. He looked at her. He looked at the maids, who both stepped sideways in unison. He looked back at her. Did you, he said slowly, break into my kitchen for soup? No. What would you call it? I followed destiny. Your kitchen produced a smell, and I had a responsibility to investigate. Pregnancy gives a woman a nose like a hunting hound. I had no choice. It would have been medically dangerous to ignore it. The Duke stood in the doorway for a long moment. Something passed across his face, too fast to identify. Then he said, flatly, sit down. She sat. He sent the maids out. He served her a bowl himself, which she understood, later, was because he was not a man who called for help when he could do something himself. He set the bowl in front of her with bread and a spoon and returned to stand at the counter with his arms crossed, watching her in the manner of someone who has not yet decided how angry to be. She ate. She ate with genuine joy, which was a thing some people are embarrassed about, but Avellini had never been. She made sounds of appreciation. She tore the bread properly. She finished the bowl and then looked up and said, your cook is talented but afraid of salt. This would be magnificent with 2 more pinches. The recipe is 40 years old. 40 years ago, people also believed bleeding cured illness. Some traditions deserve to end. She folded her hands on the table. Do you eat alone every night? He said nothing. That is not a provocative question. I am genuinely asking. This kitchen is large enough for 20 people. That table in your dining room seats 30. And you eat alone. I prefer it. You prefer it, she repeated, slowly. Right. She looked at him for a moment. He had taken off his coat and was in his shirt sleeves, which seemed like a private detail she was not supposed to have access to. His jaw was set. His expression was entirely closed. But his eyes, she had noticed his eyes twice now, moved differently from his face. They were not closed. They were watching. What happened to your wife? She asked. The room went completely still. He looked at her. I was told she died, Avellini said quietly. I am not asking to be cruel. I am asking because you live in a beautiful estate full of beautiful things, and you move through it like a man serving a sentence. And I have enough personal experience with grief this year to recognize the specific way it changes a person's face. He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, 2 years ago. I am sorry. He looked away. His right hand moved slightly against the counter, not quite pressing, not quite gripping, just resting, just holding something. I am very sorry, she said again. He nodded once, tightly, the way men nod when they have decided that is all they will give the moment. She did not push further. She finished her bread. He poured her a small glass of water without being asked. She thanked him. He made a sound in his throat that might have been acknowledgement. Your Grace, she said, pushing back from the table and standing with the particular negotiation that very pregnant women perform with chairs. Thank you for the soup. You helped yourself to it. And you gave me a glass of water and bread and stood there while I ate it, which means you consented. He stared at her. Good night, she said pleasantly, and walked back toward the kitchen door. Miss Wycliffe. She turned. He was still standing at the counter, both hands now flat on the surface. His face was that closed expression, but his jaw had shifted, not quite soft, not quite hard, somewhere between. The pump is repaired, he said, and there will be firewood delivered to the cottage tomorrow. The east garden path has been re-graveled. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. No additional words. No joke. Just that. She left. He stood in the kitchen alone for 11 minutes. Then he went to his study, poured himself a glass of brandy, sat down, and tried to read. He made it through 4 pages. It was Mrs. Cordelia Aldrich who first noticed. She noticed the way the Duke began appearing near the eastern windows at certain hours of the day. She noticed the way he sent additional provisions to the cottage without being asked, a second wool blanket, an extra oil lamp, a basket of apples from the kitchen stores. She noticed that when the estate accounts listed a repair to the cottage garden fence, he had approved it within 20 minutes of the written request crossing his desk, when normally such things took 3 days. She said nothing. She was a professional, but she noticed. The tension between them became a thing with its own shape. They argued constantly and at volume, which was unusual for a man who chose silence by default and a woman who chose combat by instinct. They argued about the temperature of the hot water delivered to the cottage. They argued about the timing of the kitchen gate being locked. They argued about the east garden path, which she called deceptively uneven, and he called functional, and she called a theory, and he called the conversation over, and she called a typical aristocratic dodge, and he nearly smiled. That was the thing. The nearly smiling. It happened twice the first week, 4 times the second, and by the third week Mrs. Aldrich had begun privately referring to it as the development in her household journal, which she kept under lock and key. For his part, the Duke told himself he found her insufferable. He said it in specific terms. She was loud. She was intrusive. She had no concept of appropriate estate behavior. She had arrived uninvited into his kitchen, eaten his soup, criticized his cook's use of salt, asked him personal questions about his dead wife, and thanked him with such straightforward sincerity that he had not known what to do with it for 2 days. He did not enjoy her company. He was, however, increasingly aware of when she was nearby. She called him his grumpiness for the first time on an afternoon when he found her sitting on the low stone wall of the east garden, eating an apple that had definitely come from the kitchen garden, watching the afternoon clouds. "You are eating my apples," he said. "Your trees, technically. The apple donated itself. That is not how property works." She looked at him. "His grumpiness has arrived." "I beg your pardon." "His grumpiness. That is what I have decided to call you in my private thoughts. It is efficient. Do you want an apple?" She held out a second one, which she had apparently pocketed in advance. He looked at the apple. He sat down on the wall beside her, 3 feet away, at a proper distance, and took the apple. She was surprised enough that she said nothing for a full 10 seconds. "Are you well?" he asked eventually. "Physically?" "More or less. I have some back pain, and this child moves at 3 in the morning like it is rehearsing for something." "How long remaining?" 4 weeks. Perhaps 5. The midwife in Salisbury believes late October. He nodded. He turned the apple in his hand. "I called you something too," he said. She looked at him. "In my thoughts." "What?" "The loudest woman in England." She burst out laughing. A real one, sudden, unguarded, loud enough that a bird lifted from the far hedge and fled the property entirely. The Duke watched her laugh. He was doing it again. That thing where something moved inside his chest that had no business moving. He bit the apple. Her name was Beatrix Winslow, and she arrived at Blackthorn Estate on a gray Tuesday with a carpet bag, a drawn face, and the specific anxiety of a woman who believed she was about to be proven right about something terrible. She was 22, engaged to a young nobleman named Godfrey Pembroke, who had arrived at the estate 2 days earlier claiming to be visiting on business with the Duke, a claim the Duke had been confused by but accepted, since Pembroke was a distant acquaintance and the manor had 4 spare bedrooms. Beatrix had not been invited. She had followed. She explained none of this to the footman who answered the door. She explained it, in full, loud detail, to Avellini, who happened to be coming around the east path with her arms full of stolen rosemary at the exact moment Beatrix stopped her horse at the cottage gate, completely lost, looking like she was about to cry or fight and had not decided which. "Are you all right?" Avellini called. "No," Beatrix said. "I am looking for Godfrey Pembroke. He told me he was here on estate business, but he did not write for 5 days, and something is wrong. I can feel that something is wrong. People tell me I am dramatic, but I am not dramatic. I am accurate, and something is wrong." Avellini set down the rosemary. "Come inside," she said. What followed was a 20-minute conversation in the cottage kitchen involving 2 cups of tea, a great deal of information, and Avellini's face moving through several expressions that started at sympathy and ended at a particular set of the jaw that people who knew her would have recognized as the face she made immediately before doing something inadvisable. "He is in the manor," Avellini said. "Yes. And you believe he is not here for business." "I believe he is here for something else. But I cannot go into the manor. I have no invitation. I have no proof. If I am wrong, I will look like a hysteric, and he will tell everyone I am unstable, and—" "You are not going alone," Avellini said. She stood up. "What? I live here. Effectively. The Duke barely notices me anymore when I enter his property." This was not fully accurate, but Beatrix did not know that. Come. What happened next would be discussed in 3 counties for the better part of a year. Avellini brought Beatrix through the cottage entrance, which connected to the manor's east corridor near the library. It was 3:30. Most of the servants were occupied with preparations for dinner. The Duke was in his study on the west side of the building. They were almost to the main stair when they heard it. The sound of a woman's voice from the 3rd guest room above. Not speaking. Laughing. Beatrix stopped. Avellini looked at her. Beatrix walked up the stairs. Avellini, who would later explain to the Duke that she merely accompanied a distressed woman through a building, followed. Beatrix opened the guest room door. Inside, Godfrey Pembroke, half undressed, with a woman named Sybil Eversley, a widow of 28 who had also apparently arrived at the estate that week under the guise of visiting distant connections. For one full second, Nobody in that room breathed. Then Beatrix screamed. Sybil Eversley screamed. Godfrey grabbed his jacket. Beatrix picked up the nearest object, a china wash basin, and threw it. She missed by 8 inches, which shattered the mirror behind Godfrey's head instead, which was somehow more dramatic. The crash brought 2 maids running. The 2 maids screaming brought a footman. The footman's shouting brought Mrs. Aldrich. Mrs. Aldrich's appearance in the hallway, staring at the open door with the expression of a woman encountering the end of an era, coincided precisely with the Duke appearing at the top of the staircase. Godfrey was still trying to button his jacket. Avellini was standing in the corridor with both hands pressed protectively in front of her stomach, watching the chaos with the focused calm of a woman who has caused enough scenes herself to know how they resolve. "Sisterhood shall not perish today," she announced loudly, to no one in particular, but everyone in general. Then she took Beatrix by the arm, steered her firmly down the corridor and away from Godfrey Pembroke and everything connected to him, down the stairs, out the east door, back to the cottage. The Duke stood at the top of the staircase. He looked at Godfrey. Godfrey had the appearance of a man who understood his visit had concluded. "My house," said the Duke, very quietly, "is not a location for this. You will leave by morning." Godfrey left before dinner. That evening, the Duke came to the cottage. Avellini answered the door with the rosemary she had finally gotten around to hanging in bundles from the kitchen beam. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Come in," she said. He ducked through the low doorway and stood in her kitchen. It was the first time he had been in the cottage since she arrived. He looked around briefly, at the small hearth she had decorated with 2 candlesticks, at the chair she had pulled close to the window, at the small table covered in letters she was writing to nobody in particular. "Miss Winslow," he asked. "She is staying here tonight. She will take the morning coach back to Trowbridge. Her family is there." Avellini hung another rosemary bundle. "She is all right. She is angry, which is the correct response. What you did was, I know. You cannot enter my manor, and I know. You may tell me so formally tomorrow if you like. Tonight she needed someone, and I was there." She turned to look at him. "You would have done the same." He was quiet. "You would have," she said again. Quietly. Not a challenge. Just certainty. He looked at the window. He had his hands behind his back. She had noticed he did that when he was thinking, when something was happening inside him that he would not let reach his face. "My wife," he said. She went very still. Her name was Cecily. He said it like a man pressing his thumb against a bruise. Gently, to see if it still hurt. It did. She was 27 when she died. He kept his eyes on the window. 2 years ago, November. There was a storm. The physician was 40 minutes from the estate, and the roads were. He stopped. "I trained as a physician before the title, before the estate, before all of it. I had the knowledge. I thought I could." He stopped again. "Both of them died," he said. "My son, my wife, in the same hour, beneath my hands." The cottage was completely quiet. Avellini set down the rosemary. She walked to the small table and sat down on the chair nearest him. Not touching, not speaking, just present. "I left medicine afterward," he said. "I left London. I left society. I locked this estate, and he exhaled. "I was done. And then some terrible woman arrived and started screaming at a fish merchant in your courtyard," Avellini said. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on a face directed at him in 2 years. Not pity, not sympathy, something more direct than that. Something that saw him clearly and was not looking away. "For what it is worth," she said, "I do not believe you are done." He said nothing. "You are damaged," she said. "That is different." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Good night, Miss Wycliffe. Good night, Your Grace." He left. She sat in the chair for a while after, one hand resting on her stomach, listening to the wind in the east garden. The baby kicked. "I know," she whispered. 3 days later, in the library, during a rainstorm that drove the temperature down and the fire up, they sat on opposite ends of the same hearthrug arguing about whether Dickens was a genius or simply a man who wrote too long. And at some point the arguing stopped, and the silence that replaced it was not empty. It was full, crowded, warm, and he had leaned slightly toward her, and she had been looking at his mouth, and he had become very still, and he pulled back. He stood up. He said he had letters to answer. He left. She sat at the fire for a long time. Then she pressed both hands to her face and said, into her palms, "Avellini, you absolute fool." It was an ordinary Wednesday evening when it started. She had eaten properly. She had walked her usual path through the garden in the late afternoon. She had come back in, set water to heat, and reached for the pot on the high shelf. the one she had told herself 3 times not to use because it required her to stand on her toes, and her foot slipped on the damp kitchen floor. She caught herself on the counter. She did not fall, but the movement, the sudden twist to the right, sent something sharp and immediate through the lower half of her body, and she gripped the counter with both hands and stood very still for 30 seconds, breathing. Then it came again, stronger. She looked at the clock on the kitchen shelf. It was 7:30. She sat down. It came again at 23 minutes to 8. No, she said aloud. To the room, to the baby, to no one. No, not yet. For more weeks. We agreed. The baby did not respond to the agreement. By 8 o'clock, she was gripping the chair back with both hands. By 1/4 past, she was on the floor, which she had sat down on intentionally because it felt safer and closer. By 1/2 past, she told herself she needed help, and this was not the time to be stubborn, which meant she was already past the point of reasonable action because she was never not stubborn. She managed to open the cottage door. The estate grounds were dark and windy. She called out once. A gardener's boy crossing the far path heard her and ran. Within 12 minutes, 2 maids and Mrs. Aldridge were in the cottage, and one of the footmen had already sprinted toward the main manor in the rain. The Duke was in his study. He heard the running feet on the gravel before the knock came. He heard the urgency in the knock before the door opened. He was already standing when the young footman, red-faced and soaked, appeared in the doorway and said, "Your Grace, it's Miss Wycliffe. She is in labor, sir. Early, the maids think. She is in the cottage." Edmund Ravenshaw's body went cold. He had not known it would still do that. He had believed, in some practical part of himself, that 2 years was long enough to separate the past from the present. He had been wrong. His hands were against the desk. His wife's face appeared in his memory without permission. Cecily, her dark hair against the pillow. Her voice, which had been afraid, which had tried not to be afraid because she had not wanted him to be afraid. The storm, the lamp. The moment he understood the bleeding was not going to stop, and there was nothing he could do. "Your Grace." He heard Avellini's voice in his head. Not a memory, a present thing, loud and alive and entirely herself. "Somebody help me before this child exits my body and starts paying taxes." He grabbed his coat. He covered the distance from the manor to the cottage in less than 2 minutes. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Mrs. Aldridge was giving instructions with her housekeeper's voice, the one that expected immediate compliance. 2 maids moved with the efficient panic of people doing their best. Avellini was upstairs in the cottage bedroom, and the sound of her was real, present, angry, alive. "Is someone going to help me, or are you all conducting a survey?" He took the stairs. She was in the bed. Her hair was loose and dark against the pillow. She was sweating. She was gripping the headboard with one hand. When she saw him in the doorway, she stared for a moment, and something crossed her face that was not quite relief and not quite fear, but something between them. "Your Grace," she said, through her teeth. "I am here," he said. "The physician will not arrive in time." He crossed to the bed. His hands were steady now. He noted this with distant surprise. He had not expected them to be steady. "I need to examine you. I need to understand where we are." She looked at him. "I know medicine," he said, quietly, just to her. "I have done this before." Something in her face shifted. She knew what that cost him to say. She had heard the story. She knew what the last time looked like and what it had left behind. "All right," she said. He examined her. Then he looked up. His face had changed, not panicked, but urgent in a way that was very focused and very clear. "Avellini," he said, her first name, the first time, not even noticed until later. "The baby's head is already descended. You are very close. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to do exactly what I say." She looked at him for 1 second. Then she said, "If you tell me to breathe, I will find the strength to throw something." He almost laughed. "Even then, even in that room, do not throw anything," he said. "Push." What followed was 41 minutes. It was loud and frightening, and at several points all 3 maids were praying at different volumes in the corners of the room. Mrs. Aldridge was useful in the precise and unshakable way that certain women are during crises. She did not panic and she did not faint, and she handed him what he needed before he asked for it. Avellini cursed. She apologized. She cursed again. She told him between contractions that he had an unacceptable bedside manner, and he told her she was doing well, and she told him not to patronize her, and he said he was not patronizing her. She was genuinely doing well, and she said, "How would you know what well looks like? You emotionally unavailable." "Push," he said. She pushed. And then, a cry. Small. Furious. absolutely present. The room went completely silent except for that small, furious sound. Edmund Ravenshaw held the child. His hands, both of them, were completely steady. He looked at the baby. He looked at what he was holding. He looked at the small, red, screaming, absolutely alive face. Something broke open in his chest. It was not the grief. The grief had already been there, had lived there for 2 years, had become familiar and constant and cold. This was something else. Something that cracked through the cold and went down further, to some place beneath the grief that he had not visited in a very long time. He was crying. He had not expected that. He became aware of it only when he felt the water at the edge of his jaw and realized what it was. He wrapped the baby. He turned. Avellini was watching him with dark, exhausted eyes from the pillow, watching his face with an expression he could not read because he was not looking carefully enough, because he was not sure he was ready for what he might find there. He placed the child in her arms. "A girl," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Avellini looked down at the baby. She began to cry too, quietly, without drama, which was so unlike her that it made him understand how completely undone she was. "Hello," she whispered to the child. "Hello. I have been talking to you for months. It is very good to see you." The baby made a sound. "Yes," Avellini said. "I agree." Edmund stepped back from the bed. He pressed both hands to his own face for a moment, pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, and breathed. He had thought, 2 years ago, that God had removed him from the list of people who deserved good things. He had been living accordingly. He lowered his hands. He looked at the woman in the bed and the small, living person in her arms, and he thought, perhaps not. She named the baby Cordelia. Delia for short. The housekeeper, whose name was also Cordelia, tried very hard not to cry about this, and only partially succeeded. The first 3 weeks of Delia's life were organized chaos inside the cottage, with additional chaos emanating from the main manor, because the Duke had decided, without apparent discussion or announcement, that he would be involved. He appeared the morning after the birth with a covered basket from the kitchen. He appeared the following morning with additional firewood. By the third day, he was appearing twice, morning and late afternoon, sitting with the quiet competence of a man who had medical knowledge and was applying it practically, checking the baby's temperature, observing her coloring, answering questions about feeding with the particular calm of someone who had studied these things once and not forgotten them. Avellini watched him rock the baby to sleep one evening, standing at the cottage window, swaying slightly without seeming to realize he was doing it. She did not say anything. She thought a great many things. Benedict Montclair arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks later, on a day that was cold and bright, in a hired coach with good luggage and a face that was prepared. Avellini answered the cottage door. They looked at each other. He had the same handsome face, the same easy posture, the same way he held his hat, like he was used to rooms giving him their attention. But his eyes did something complicated when he saw her, and she could not immediately determine if it was guilt or calculation or some mixture that served the same purpose. "Avellini," he said. "Benedict." He asked to come in. She let him. What followed was 2 hours she would spend the rest of her life rearranging in her memory, because it was not what she had imagined when she imagined this moment, which she had, many times, in many different ways. She had imagined rage. She had imagined slamming the door. She had imagined being magnificent in her rightness and cold in her dismissal. Instead, she sat across from him at the cottage table while he talked, and she listened, and something in her chest performed the specific betrayal of not being entirely unmoved. He talked about debts, about his father's business collapse in the spring, about creditors and legal threats and the choice to leave England before he was imprisoned for what his father had done, about letters he claimed to have sent that she never received, about intentions he claimed to have held all along. He talked beautifully. He had always talked beautifully. That was the thing that had undone her in the first place. She looked at him across the table. She thought, he may be telling the truth. She thought, he may not be. She thought, I cannot tell, and I could not tell then, and that is the problem. I want to be part of her life, he said. And yours. I am prepared to do the right thing, Avellini. I am prepared to. You will need to speak to the Duke, she said. He stopped. This is his estate. Delia was born here. He has a particular involvement. She did not elaborate. I will not be making any decisions alone about my daughter or my future without his counsel. Benedict looked at her very carefully. The Duke, he said. Yes. You are on familiar terms with the Duke of Blackthorn. We are acquainted, she said, which was the most insufficient sentence she had ever constructed. The Duke met Benedict Montclair in the Manor's east sitting room the following morning. with his solicitor present and a set of documents that his solicitor had quietly prepared the previous evening. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The Duke said very little. His solicitor said more. The documents were largely about Delia, about legal acknowledgement, about financial responsibility, about what being a present father actually required in practice as opposed to intention. Benedict emerged from the meeting looking like a man who had expected something different. He came back to the cottage. He was charming and warm and spoke about the future in the specific way that was either sincere or well-rehearsed. And Avellini was 8 weeks out of childbirth and operating on fragmented sleep. And in the 3rd week of his staying at a nearby inn in the village, she let herself wonder. She wrote to her sister Primrose in Paris. She sat up late 2 nights in a row thinking. She held Delia and thought about what life looked like, in which version, with which person. The Duke stopped coming twice a day. He came once. In the mornings. Briefly. With something from the kitchen. He did not stay. He was polite. His face had returned to its closed setting. The one she had not seen in weeks. The one she had thought was behind him. She noticed. She said nothing. The second woman arrived on a Thursday. Her name was Sybil. Not Sybil Eversley from the Manor scandal, but a different Sybil entirely, a Sybil Norwood, age 20, from a small village in Somerset. She had traveled to Blackthorn Estate after reading a notice in the county paper about charitable services offered at the estate. She had written ahead. She had a letter. She was very proper about it. She was also visibly pregnant. She sat in the cottage kitchen. Avellini had taken to receiving visitors there, because her sitting room was occupied by Delia's things, and told her story carefully and without dramatic effect, which somehow made it worse. Benedict Montclair's name appeared in the 10th minute. By the 15th minute, Avellini had gone completely still. By the 20th minute, Sybil Norwood was crying quietly and Avellini was not crying at all, which was worse than crying, which is what fury looks like when it has nowhere to go. She sent Benedict away that afternoon. She did not shout. She had expected to shout. Instead, she stood at the cottage door and told him in a quiet, level voice that she knew about Somerset, and she knew about Sybil Norwood, and she did not need him to explain because she had already understood everything she needed to understand about what he was. He tried to explain anyway. She closed the door. She sat down on the cottage floor, which she did sometimes when nothing else seemed adequate, and pressed her back to the wall and held Delia against her chest and breathed. She heard the rain start outside. Heavy, the kind that came in from the west and settled in for hours. She thought, this is the 2nd time in 1 year that I have sat on a floor while a man's lies settled around me. She thought, I am so tired. She thought, I am so angry. She thought, I do not want to sit on another floor for the rest of my life because of choices men have made. Then she thought about the Duke. She thought about him standing in the cottage kitchen 8 weeks ago, hands trembling, holding her daughter, crying without seeming to know it. She thought about him sitting beside the library fire talking about Cecily in the flat, careful voice of someone whose grief had learned to wear a suit. She thought about every morning he had appeared at her door with the kitchen basket and stayed long enough to check on Delia, and then left, not overstepping, not claiming anything, just present. She put Delia down in the basket carefully. She put on her coat. She walked out into the rain. He was in the garden. Of all places, in the rain, in the east garden near the fountain, standing with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, looking at the water that was sheeting off the stone lip of the fountain basin in long, silver curtains. She stopped 10 feet away. He turned. He looked at her. At the state of her, soaked already, hair coming loose, face with that particular set that he had learned meant she was either about to fight or about to be honest, and he had learned these were sometimes the same thing. He is gone, she said. I know. Mrs. Aldridge informed me. I sent him away. I know that too. She looked at him. The rain was loud on the stone garden paths. Water ran down the back of her collar, and she did not care. You stopped coming twice, she said. He said nothing. You came once. In the mornings. Briefly. For 3 weeks, while he was here. You stopped staying. He looked away toward the fountain. Edmund, she said. He turned back immediately. Because she had never used his name. Neither of them had realized until this moment that she never had. He looked at her. Edmund, she said again, quieter. Why did you stop staying? He stood in the rain for a long moment. Then he said, because I could not watch you choose him and remain a rational person. She went very still. I tried, he said. I tried to be reasonable about it. He is her father. You once cared for him. You deserve the chance to decide without someone like me in the way. Someone like you, she repeated. Broken, he said. Old. Afraid. He said each word like he was reading them off a list he had compiled against himself. Still caught between one grief and whatever this is. Not the most compelling alternative. She walked toward him. She stopped 2 feet away. Close enough that she had to tilt her head to look at him properly, because he was tall and she was not. And she had always found this slightly aggravating and had never said so. "You delivered my child," she said. He said nothing. "You sat with her at 3 in the morning when she would not stop crying. You fixed my water pump. You sent blankets and firewood and apple baskets without saying why. You laughed at my jokes, and I know that matters because apparently nobody had made you laugh in 2 years." She reached up and pressed one hand flat against his chest. "You are not broken. You are the most functional person I have met in the worst year of my life. And I have met you during the worst year of my life, which means the bar was low and you still cleared it by a significant margin." He looked at her hand on his chest. He looked at her face. He said, "You stormed into my life like complete disaster." "Yes." "And somehow became the only piece I have left." She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced, slightly damp, a ring. A plain band. Gold. Old. He had clearly not planned this moment as well as the ring itself suggested, because he then appeared to make a decision mid-sentence and dropped to one knee on the wet stone garden path. She stared at him. A duke. On his knees. In the rain. Holding a gold ring in one hand and looking up at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not closed, not controlled, not careful. Just open. Just him. "Marry me," he said. "Bring your noise into my house. Stay. Both of you." She put both hands over her mouth. Her eyes went bright with water, not just rain. "Your Grace," she said finally, "this is genuinely the worst proposal in British history. But is it a yes?" She laughed. It came out loud and a little broken and absolutely herself. "Yes," she said. "You emotionally damaged giant." He stood. He put the ring on her finger. He pulled her into his arms in the rain, and she pressed her face into his coat, and he held her in the way of someone who intended to keep holding on. The East Garden was empty except for them, and the rain and the sound of the fountain. It was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary moment. The wedding was in December. The church of St. Giles in the village had a ceiling painted blue and pale gold, which seemed appropriate. The Duke wore gray. Avellini wore ivory, which she had decided on specifically because several London society wives had whispered, through letters and mutual acquaintances, that she ought to wear something less conspicuous given the circumstances. She wore ivory with a cream veil and flowers woven through her hair, and walked down the aisle holding Delia, 6 weeks old, swaddled in white wool, who slept through the entire ceremony, except for one moment near the vows when she made a sound that the vicar generously described as an affirmation. London society was horrified. London society discussed it for months. A widowed duke, one of the oldest titles in Wiltshire, marrying a woman who had arrived on his estate with nothing, pregnant with another man's child, who had personally chased a goose with an umbrella and once removed an uninvited guest from an estate scandal by shouting about sisterhood. The Duke did not read the papers during this period. He was too busy being happy, which was disorienting after 2 years of the alternative in which he had decided to simply accept, the way one accepts unexpected weather. Marriage was not peaceful. He had known it would not be. Peace had never been among the things she offered. She offered warmth and noise and honesty, and the particular loyalty that made her stand in the rain outside his manor on a Tuesday night and say his name until he answered it. She accidentally insulted the Countess of Ellington at a winter dinner by telling her that her cook was clearly intimidated by the spice trade. The Countess was not forgiving. She told the visiting Bishop of Wiltshire that his sermon had run 15 minutes too long, and she had counted. She reorganized the Blackthorn Manor kitchen by efficiency rather than tradition, which nearly caused Mrs. Aldridge to resign until Avellini sat her down, explained her reasoning in full, apologized for not consulting her, and made her tea. Mrs. Aldridge did not resign. She asked Edmund about medicine. Not once. Repeatedly. Over months. She asked him in the mornings over breakfast. She asked him in the evenings beside the library fire. She asked him about the maternity cases he remembered from his training. She asked him about what resources existed for women in their county who could not afford proper care. She asked him, quietly and consistently, in the way she did everything, with the patient certainty of someone who knew the answer was coming and was prepared to wait. He returned to medicine in February. He began at the estate itself, quietly, consulting cases that arrived through the servants' connections, then through the village. By April, he had established a small clinic in Aldbourne, 12 miles east. By the following year, he had opened 2 more. He named them for Cecily. He told Avellini this one morning. She set down her tea and looked at him for a moment. Then she took his hand and held it, and said nothing, because some things are not improved by words. Avellini's business ventures began, as most of her ventures began, through the specific mechanism of being annoyed by the current situation and deciding to improve it. The estate gardens produced more herbs than the kitchen could use. She had been selling small batches to the local market for 3 months before she told Edmund. When she told him, she had a ledger. He reviewed it, made 2 notes, and connected her with a merchant contact in Bristol. Within 18 months, Blackthorn Estate's specialty herb and botanical trade was generating revenue that impressed Edmund's solicitor so substantially that the solicitor asked twice if he had misread the figures. He had not. She added specialty preserves, then imported spices through a connection Primrose had made in Paris. Then herbal preparations for women during pregnancy, which she developed in consultation with Edmund and which became, somewhat to everyone's surprise, the most profitable element of the enterprise. She hired 6 women from the village to run the production. She paid them above the standard rate. She told Edmund this after the fact. He looked at the ledger, then at her, then at the ledger again. "The margins still work," she said. "I can see that. I know you can." I made sure. He set down the ledger and looked at her with the expression she had identified, in the months of their marriage, as the one that meant he found her genuinely remarkable, but did not know how to say so without it sounding excessive. "Avellini," he said. You are extraordinary." She pointed her pen at him. "Do not say it like you're surprised." "I'm not surprised. I am stating a fact. Every 6 months, minimum," she said. "That is the interval at which I require that fact to be stated. You may mark it in your calendar." He did. The children arrived like weather. First Delia, who by 2 years old had Edmund completely devoted to her in a way that was embarrassing for a man who had once governed an estate of 400 acres with a face like closed stone. He read her stories every night. He carried her around the gardens naming every plant. He built her a small wooden cart that she immediately drove into a garden wall and celebrated. Then came their son, Wilfred Ravenshaw, in the 2nd year of marriage. A boy who from birth had Avellini's directness and Edmund's stubbornness, which was a particular combination. He painted 2 of the hunting dogs blue at age 3 using leftover paint from the stable fence project. Edmund did not punish him. He examined the workmanship and said that the coverage was actually quite even. Their 2nd daughter, Beatrix, named, with permission, for the young woman from the Manor scandal who had become a genuine friend, once bit the Bishop of Wiltshire's thumb at a formal dinner. The bishop had reached across her plate without asking. He reached first, Beatrix said. Neither parent argued the point. And then came young Edmund. Ned, they called him, who, at age 4, locked a visiting Viscount inside the estate pantry for 45 minutes after the Viscount made a comment about his mother's accent. The Viscount was not invited back. Edmund adored it all. He adored it with a specific, concentrated joy that was the direct inverse of 2 years of silence. Every loud dinner, every garden chase, every impossible argument, every small body that demanded to be carried and held and read to and chased through the halls of Blackthorn Manor. He adored it with the particular gratitude of someone who had stood in an empty room and believed nothing would ever fill it again. It was filled. It was very full. He had not known he could be this happy. He had not known he deserved to be. There is a particular quality to October mornings in Wiltshire. The light comes in at a low angle and makes everything gold. The stone walls, the garden gravel, the remaining leaves on the oak trees at the estate's eastern edge. It is the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they have been preserved. Edmund Ravenshaw stood in the carriage courtyard on such a morning, 10 years after the day the carriages had brought a ruined trunk and a heavily pregnant young woman through his gate before sunrise. The courtyard was not empty anymore. Ned, age 6, was chasing Delia, age 10, across the stones with a wooden sword. Wilfred, 8, was watching from the fountain wall with the specific detached judgment of a second child. Young Beatrix, age 7, was nowhere visible, which was always the most alarming option. Servants crossed the yard on various errands, most of them smiling, none of them looking alarmed, which was the natural state of Blackthorn Estate on an ordinary morning. The manor's east wing was lit warm. From inside came the sound of someone at the piano, a student, being corrected loudly by their instructor, and the smell of something from the kitchen that was probably the good bread. Edmund's 3 clinics were operating with 8 physicians between them. The estate had expanded its charitable endowment the previous spring. The shipping investments were producing returns that had allowed them to fund a fourth clinic in Bath, which Avellini had campaigned for, specifically because Bath was where she had met Benedict Montclair, and she had decided that the location deserved to become associated with something better. He had agreed. He stood in the courtyard and turned these things over in his mind in the same way he sometimes turned the wedding ring on his finger, not examining it, just noting that it was there. You were staring at the fountain again. He turned. Avellini was behind him, their youngest child, a small boy they had named Godfrey, which was Avellini's idea of a private joke, on her hip. He was 2 years old and deeply asleep in the way only very young children can manage emotion. She had gray in her hair at the temples now. He had told her this was distinguished. She had told him he was biased. He had said yes, obviously, and she had laughed in the way she still laughed, sudden, loud, entirely herself. I was not staring at the fountain, he said. I was looking at Ned. Ned is behind you. He turned. Ned had paused the sword chase and was now, inexplicably, attempting to climb the gatepost. Ned, Edmund said. Ned looked at him. No. Ned climbed down without particular resentment. This was the dynamic. Edmund said no. Ned evaluated the no, and about half the time the no was sufficient. The other half required Avellini. Between them they managed. She came to stand beside him. The young Godfrey made a small sound and resettled without waking. You're doing it, she said. What? The face. The remembering face. She looked at him sideways. What year are you in? He was quiet for a moment. The first morning, he said. The fish merchant. Oh. She looked out across the courtyard. The rotten trout that nearly carried me to heaven. You were so angry. I was magnificently angry. I had been traveling for 16 hours. I had food poisoning. I was 8 months pregnant, and a man expected me to pay full price for the fish that caused the food poisoning. The anger was proportionate. You pointed at me and told me to control my estate people. You had the face. The funeral face. I maintained that instruction was reasonable. He reached out and took her free hand. She led him, the way she always led him. Easily, without ceremony, without making it a moment. It had been one of the things he had learned about her. She did not need things to be moments. She just needed them to be real. I thought, that morning, he said, that you were the most inconvenient thing that had ever arrived on this property. That tracks. I also thought, he stopped. What? I also thought, she is very alive. She looked at him. I had forgotten what that looked like, he said. Completely, thoroughly alive. In the specific way of a person who has decided to be present in whatever is happening, no matter what it costs them. I had not seen that in, he paused. A long time. She looked at the courtyard. At Delia, who had given up being chased and was now doing something with the garden hose near the east wall. At Ned, who had found a different and equally inadvisable object to climb. At Wilfred, still on the fountain wall, still watching his siblings with the patient expression of someone compiling evidence. Do you regret it? She asked. Quietly. Not a vulnerable question. She was not a vulnerable questioner. A genuine one. Regret what? All of it. Marrying me. The noise. The children. The Viscount in the pantry. Godfrey. She adjusted the sleeping boy's weight on her hip. The 47 dinners I have accidentally turned into arguments with your colleagues. 49, he said. You counted. With affection. She laughed. He turned to face her. She turned to face him. The morning light was doing its October thing. Gold on her face. Gold on the gray at her temples. Gold on the sleeping child between them. No, he said. I do not regret a single thing. She looked at him for a moment. Good, she said. Because I have decided to expand the herb operation into Wales, and I will need your shipping contacts. He blinked. That is my answer? I declare no regrets, and you require my shipping contacts. I also love you, she said pleasantly. Both things. He pulled her gently toward him, sideways, carefully, accounting for the sleeping Godfrey, and she turned her face against his shoulder, and he pressed his cheek to her hair, and they stood in the courtyard while their children performed mild chaos around them, and the October sun made everything gold. This was the life he had stopped believing he was allowed. This was the noise that had replaced the silence. This was what surviving looked like, when someone loud and terrible and fiercely alive walked into your courtyard at dawn and pointed at you and demanded you pay attention. He had paid attention. He had paid attention every day since. 10 years earlier, a man had stood at the top of a staircase and watched a woman scream at a fish merchant before sunrise, and something in his chest had moved for the first time in years, and he had been irritated by it. Now he stood in the same courtyard, and the woman beside him was arguing with their son about the gatepost, and their daughter had somehow gotten the garden hose turned on, and Wilfred was still watching from the wall, and the house behind them was warm and loud and impossibly full. He had once thought his life ended in a birthing room. He had been wrong. It had only been waiting, cold and quiet and patient, for someone to come through the gate and insist on starting it again. She had insisted, loudly, with a fish merchant. At dawn, he would not have changed a single thing. They say the loudest storms always arrive without warning. And sometimes, if you are lucky enough to survive them, they leave behind a life you did not know you were capable of living.